welcome to Season 6, Episode 19 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading James Hitchcock's History of the Catholic Church from the Apostolic Age to the Third Millennium. This time, reading Chapter 13, or Part 1 of Chapter 13, split this one into half again, talking about the new nations of Canada, the United States, and Australia, and how the Catholic Church sort of evolved and spread throughout those countries. Again, I think we're going to talk about all of Canada was in the beginning here, and then like half of America, and then we won't get to Australia till next week. But the section on Australia was short. I don't think you've read it yet, but
I have not.
I read it. It was interesting, but the section on America is really good in this chapter.
Well, I didn't know there were a lot of Catholics in Australia.
Yeah, I don't think there were.
Maybe that's why the part of the chapter is short. But
that is true.
I did not read that.
That is true.
Yet, so don't spoil it. No spoilers.
I won't. Okay.
So
it already happened.
Yeah, but I haven't
history.
read it.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's just like reading a book that's already been written.
Well, I guess that's true.
All right. So should we get to it?
I think so.
What do you want to start with? Anyway, so I was really fascinated by the amount of Irish priests and clergy, you know, in America and Canada. I thought that was an interesting kind of theme. But anyway, so what do I want to start with? I mean, the book starts with just an introduction talking about, you know, this was these are new and modern nations. Mm-hmm. And so they were more apt to have kind of a trial and error process by which, you know, the Catholic Church is interacting with the democratic society. And I think it really gets into it. It's been like over a week since I read this, so I'm trying to remember all the themes I was thinking of before. But one of the themes I thought was interesting is that there was so little state involvement, mm-hmm. especially in the United States, with regard to any of the churches, but especially the Catholic Church. There's no official involvement, and I think at some point we're gonna get to it. The bishops, when they're selected by the Pope and in the hierarchy, ran it by, I think it was George Washington, and but the message came back saying, "That's none of our business. You do whatever you want with your church.
We don't care.
Why are you contacting me as if I need to somehow consent or even provide input?"
It's like the first nation to ever do that.
Yeah.
Because, you know, throughout all of church history, you know, there's been some sort of civic leader who's like, I want to say, and who has this position. Yeah. And he goes into it a little bit later, that, you know, that's kind of a good thing and a bad thing for the Catholic Church. And like, you know, you're free to do, you know, whatever. But then again, you don't have official support from the government as you would in maybe, you know, more Catholic-friendly nations. So it's sort of a pros and cons to it. So
let's get right into it. Like the book really talks about the British Enlightenment and how influential, because these are British colonies we're talking about, the United States, Canada, and Australia, because unlike in Europe and Latin America, there was never any attempt to use the power of the states to suppress Christianity by any factions. Yeah. And so there was a freedom, and there might have been like there's societal encouragement, but certainly there was not any sort of suppression of Christianity or any anti-clerical movements. You know, as these countries were being expanded and all that sort of thing. So there was full religious toleration. So there's a section about toleration, and because it was a very tolerant attitude, and it's part of the reason why people came over here. There were various indigenous religions, such as they were, and it mentions that Puritanism evolved into evangelicalism and fundamentalism, which I probably need to study a little bit more about Puritanism because I'm not really familiar with the history of that. And so you still had a certain amount of prejudice and chauvinism, as the author points out, because Catholics were accused of being disloyal to these new countries. You know, the whole thing. You know, you choose your ruler, either the civil authority or the Pope, because the Pope has so much. It's a hierarchical structure in the Catholic Church, which is not the same as other religions.
He also goes into, talking about the anti-Catholicism. This is, throughout the chapter, but he brings up the Freemasons a lot, which is very interesting. I need to look more into them as sort of probably the biggest opponents to Catholicism in, this point in time in American history. Just overall with who is, seeing the Catholics as the enemies, it's probably the Freemasons for the most part.
Well, for sure. They're the traditional rivals of the Knights of Columbus.
Yeah, that's true.
Who are formed in the United States. But I don't think anybody even knows that now.
Yeah.
Nobody even knows the history. Like I mentioned, because I think the Shriners, aren't the Shriners an offshoot of Freemasonry?
I think they are,
and
in some capacity.
And I mentioned to somebody whose relative, older guy, grandfather was a Shriner. They talk about all the, they do great, work and all that. And he mentioned to me, well, why, maybe you should join. You're into that volunteerism. And I said, well, I can't. The Knights of Columbus hate them. And I was only half joking, But he's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, traditionally the Freemasons and movement was anti-Catholic. Mm-hmm. He's like, what? I said, yeah. They were completely against Catholics. Yeah. And there's two Catholic guys talking. Anyway, so Christianity was the religion, though, and coming over to these new countries, and there was no. Originally, I don't think there was any state-sponsored educational system. It was all religious schools, and so this religious education flourished, which of course the Catholics were very good at and very expansive at as the population increased. Yes,
he makes the good point that it's not just that everybody was Christian; so everybody assumed that the society was Christian.
Yes,
like it was assumed that this is a Christian country. Same thing Canada, United States, and Australia. It's really just the flavor of Christianity, which denomination.
Right.
That's what you really get into. It wasn't assumed. We're an atheist secular nation. No, we're a Christian nation. And be that as it may, that's where we get all these religious schools and such.
There was one thing I thought he mentioned at the beginning of the chapter that I thought was struck by, that there was. Oh, yeah, there was, he mentions in here, there was never any attempt to use the power of the state to suppress Christianity. But I think there are examples in this chapter of people using power to prosecute individual Christian leaders and movements. But I thought I was like, well, that wasn't free from, really, I guess it would be anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
Actually, anti-Catholic political movements, because I think we even get into the Know Nothing Party.
I think so.
Which is a great name for a political party. But I've never really understood. I mean, I've read about that, but it just seemed like such a weird name for them to accept. Yes. So he does mention just briefly the history of Canada, with the Vikings being the true discoverers of that land. What in the year, somewhere around the year 1000. Mm-hmm. But really, the European influence or presence really didn't reappear until like 1500, I think.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, he says the French founded the trading post of Quebec in 1608, and so that's really what we're talking about when we're looking at Canadian Catholicism, as it's really all centered around Quebec and the region there, because it's just so very, very much French, and sort of a very traditional French in a way that differed from a lot of what France really became later on with the French Revolution and everything.
Correct.
With how tied into the language and everything that they were there.
Yeah. And there's a really interesting whole section on the French missionaries in that area, and some of these I've heard of, and some of them I haven't. Like Saint Isaac, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Jogues. How do you pronounce that in French?
I'd say Jogues.
What? So there was so he had he was captured by the Iroquois, and people think and I'm always amused by people who think that the Indians were just peace-loving spiritualists. Well, the Iroquois were killers, and they were lethal enemies of the Huron, which is a different tribe. Of course, this guy, he ended up, he was martyred or murdered by the Iroquois.
But before that, he had his fingers chewed off.
Yeah.
When he came over to be a missionary. They chewed his fingers off, and then was ransomed in New York by a Netherlandish Protestant trader, and then returned to France, and then eventually was then martyred by the Iroquois upon returning to Quebec.
Right. So, but he got a papal dispensation from the requirement concerning the holding of the Eucharist during Mass because he didn't have any fingers.
Yeah.
That's dedicated to have them chew off his fingers and then go back and still try to minister with them.
Yeah. I feel like if someone chewed off my fingers, I wouldn't want to talk to them again.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe it's not the same exact people.
That's true.
Maybe a different village. Maybe not. I don't know. So that was 3 years later. They murdered 5 other Jesuits, including Saint John de Brebeuf. Brebeuf died in 1649. This goes pretty far back, where these missionaries are out there. He was working. He worked with the Hurons for over 30 years, and the author mentions that in each case of these martyrs, the martyrdom was by a slow process of dismembering and burning. So again, another example of these peaceful spirit people.
Yes, dismembering and burning followed by cannibalism.
Oh yeah, well you gotta cook your food first, I guess. But this guy was greatly admired for his strength and dedication. So that ended up meaning that they wanted to eat him.
They ate his heart to assimilate his courage.
Yes, so then there was Saint Catherine Kateri Tekakwitha.
There you go.
Who died in 1680. She was an orphan daughter of a pagan Iroquois father and a Catholic mother. She was another one of these missionaries that's out there, and they mentioned that the people were nomadic, and so that created a lot of challenges. And I think there was some mention of that in talking about South America, the challenges with trying to proselytize and convert people to the religion, because if they were in one place, they tended to be more easily or more readily converted as opposed to the nomadic people.
Yeah, and there's a mention they tried to a lot of times make them more sedentary people. They tried to establish farms for them so that they could settle down and stay in one place, but oftentimes it did not work.
Yeah, and they mentioned that one of the problems was that they had so many native languages that had to be learned, and there was no dictionary, no written language, because they were illiterate nomads that we idolize presently, but they were literally illiterate nomads with no functioning civil society, infrastructure, indoor plumbing, outdoor plumbing, or any of the necessities of a civilized life.
Yes.
I'm just pointing that out.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, just because I think it needs to be said.
Yes. And it also, is important that these languages are entirely different than anything that any other missionaries would have spoken. Completely
Correct.
different from anything in Europe, Asia, Africa. Entirely different families of languages. Even throughout North America.
Yeah.
It's not even monolithic. All of these languages are related to each other. No, you have very isolated families that are just entirely different from one another. You have to learn very complicated, new languages.
Yes. And that is really, well, it must be really interesting to you, somebody that studies linguistics, how that developed over time. Yeah. So many different languages, and they didn't seem to splinter off from one, well, maybe they did way back when from one common language, but it seems like they were so, I'm not an expert on it, but so different, and so they had to learn so many different languages to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
And these missionaries really help, because as they're living among the Indians for many years, then the Indians would learn French or English, as the case may be, as a second language, and thereby facilitating communication, the other direction.
Well, it's because a lot of them were so isolated.
Right.
You just live within your own family, your own tribe. You wouldn't really have too much contact, except through war or
murder,
or infrequent trade and stuff like that. So it's you're not going to be around people who would share a common language. Your shared common language is your own isolated community, and that just can lead to the language changing very differently from this other isolated community.
Yes.
If they were related in the past.
So what are the other challenges with the native religion and converting people? Well, of course, they practice cannibalism, which is frowned upon by Christians. And so
true.
the missionaries cleverly did not emphasize the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist to try to not encourage cannibalism.
Yes, that's good.
And commonly they also had polygamy, which is frowned upon by God. But it's coming back. Maybe that's why these New Age people like the Indians, but they probably don't even know that.
Maybe next will be cannibalism.
Why not?
That's true.
Well, if somebody consents to the removal of their pinky, why would it be wrong for somebody to eat it?
I have heard that is legal in the UK. If someone dies and it's like in their will, like I give permission for this person to like cook and eat my arm, then there's no punishment.
Yeah, well, I think we're really progressing as society.
I think so too.
We're moving in the right direction.
It's a sign that we're becoming more rational.
I just don't know. I mean, yesterday I was saying I was optimistic about society,
everything, and then now
I woke up this morning and I'm just the exact opposite.
Good,
I'm like, we're all going to hell. Even the people that pray, God is just going to say, you know what? No, you're all out. I'm done. We're full. Out you go. Anyway, so there was actually a seminary created in the 1600s. I think Quebec was made a diocese in 1674. So that goes way back. And they had religious vocations. They came from that area. They started a seminary in Quebec. And there were the Sisters of Notre Dame of Montreal and the Sisters of Charity of Quebec. So they had groups there and really, really well developed. But the British conquered Quebec in 1763. And so you had an influx of Protestant settlers because it was, a French outpost. And then you have the British, who are not an overly Catholic nation at the time. True. So their supporters and their immigrants, their people would be Protestants. And so they moved there for the express purpose of ensuring a Protestant ascendancy, as the author mentions. And they actually forcibly deported many of the French Acadians. And I believe, but I meant to look this up, I believe they were deported and a lot of them ended up in New Orleans.
Oh, really?
I think that's true.
I didn't know that. Huh.
There's a festival or some sort of meeting and festival and stuff up in Quebec that invites their long lost American New Orleans cousins, the French Canadians that settled New Orleans. I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I'm 92%.
That's interesting.
Certain that is accurate. 8% that I'm completely wrong.
There we go.
And so there's a War of 1812 between the United States and the the English Empire, right? It would be England. Yeah. And so Canadian Catholics were they proved their loyalty to the crown because they were against the United States they fought for England.
And so that's when really they gave Catholics, they removed any remaining restrictions because they did have some restrictions on Catholic practice and Catholics within, Quebec. But then you fought for us, you're full citizens now, I guess. No restrictions on you.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a theme of that in, certainly in American society. I think that really helped the cause for equality for African Americans. They fought in World War II.
Even Irish before that. If you can prove that you're a valuable citizen to your area, then it's like, absolutely, come on in.
Well, I'm sure we're gonna get to this in the next episode, but the Irish, they had the Irish draft riots during the Civil War in New York, but some of them fought almost as units, because I think they're Irish units. Very bravely and stoutly, and I think that helped a lot of eliminating some of that anti-Catholic bigotry at that time. But we'll get to that next episode. So, what about the future growth of the Catholic Church in Canada? The country was officially declared to be no longer a missionary territory in 1908. So it was still considered a missionary area up until that time.
And that's similar for the United States, too.
Right.
It would have been until around the 1900s.
Isn't that wild? but there's still considerable anti-Catholicism, and that's centered around who? The Masonic lodges.
What do you know?
Bastards. So what else we want to talk about them? There's, they're in Alaska. I saw this one. The Jesuits were in the unusual position of being in competition with a group that did not ordinarily proselytize the Russian Orthodox because of the Russian occupation or conquest of that area before Alaska was ultimately sold to the United States. And is now a state of the United States. But I wouldn't even think about that. So as the Jesuits are going west, they're proselytizing, but they're finding, oh my gosh, there's some Russian Orthodox people here, and they're kind of in competition with them to convert people to their religion. So Quebec, what else do we want to talk about? Quebec. It was a Catholic area, so what did they have? High birth rates, and divorce was not permitted. They had the French language, and they still have kind of a subculture and French language in their official correspondence. And
I know Quebec is still kind of seen as like, sort of the odd sort of cousin like of the Canadian provinces, still to this day, because they do still have that very distinct tie to the French language and the French culture, kind of in the same way. I know we were talking about this with the legal system in Louisiana, how they're tied to the French common law system rather than the English. So it's still sort of that similar. It's I think it's more prominent in Quebec than it is in Louisiana with the difference in culture. But
true,
similar things.
But the legal system. And I'm teaching a law class now, and there's these universal principles in American law with regard to dealing with contract law, where they have uniform statutes that are passed by virtually all of the states of the United States except for Louisiana. and when I mention that to the students, they're like, "What? What's wrong with Louisiana?" Well, it's a French common law, and anyway, so they're like, what? I don't even know what I'm talking about, so I don't want to really go into the weeds about Louisiana law. But it makes it a little bit more difficult to explain these concepts as universal when everything has an exception, which is Louisiana. It's like, it's not everywhere, so if you do any legal work in Louisiana, you have a different system. But you're right. It does kind of remind you of Quebec. Now, Quebec is much more independent. Yeah. And I remember in my youth, there were like independent movements, to try to actually.
I think there still are. I don't know how successful they are, but there's still definitely calls for it.
Yeah, they were active decades ago. I think they've reached mostly compromises on that, so there's not really an official movement for independence like there was 30 years ago or whatever. Who's that jerk prime minister they have up there?
Trudeau.
Yeah, this is his dad.
Is it really?
Yeah, it mentions Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who died in 2000. Isn't it his dad or is it his grandfather?
It might be grandfather.
Well, when would he have been born?
I'm not sure. Because Trudeau's fairly young for like a prime minister. I know that.
Yeah. But he would have been, he's at least in his 40s. So I was born in 70. So he would have been born in maybe 80. Yeah, it makes sense.
That's true.
But there are pictures of Trudeau and Trudeau's wife palling around with Castro.
Huh, yeah.
And you should look at pictures. They have them on the internet.
Yeah,
the comparisons.
The claim that he's like Castro's son.
Yeah, because he looks a lot like him. And he's basically a commie.
Yeah. Well, before the Trudeau guy, the Pierre Trudeau, it's important to mention that I think Quebec had a status as the most Catholic society in the world during the premiership of Maurice Duplessis. And that's really when clergy were really, political and social leaders, really involved in the rural economy, customs, language, and stuff. And so for a time, they were really the most traditional Catholic society in the world here. And this is really early 1900s, 1930s, 1940s, into that time period. But then you have these liberal Catholics come along who wanted to modernize Quebec society. So they wanted to move away from that tradition that was really spearheaded by Pierre Trudeau, who was this sort of liberal Catholic who wanted to modernize everything. Yeah,
he wasn't Catholic. Yeah, because they repealed the laws against divorce, contraception, and pornography, because that's what we need in the world, more pornos and easy divorce.
Yeah. It's really the same thing that's happening in the United States at this time. This is during the 1960s, so it's all of these same reform movements.
as the author mentions, all this stuff produced a powerful hedonistic reaction. Oh,
really?
That is surprising.
How did that happen?
I was not surprised. And again, in Canada, following the Second Vatican Council, which was 1962 to 65, the key signs of religious vitality in Quebec, church attendance, religious vocations, marital stability, and birth rate declined dramatically. And I mean, just statistically, what a failure that Second Vatican Council was. I mean, and maybe that decline would have happened anyway, or maybe it would have been more pronounced, but I don't know how it could be more pronounced.
I mean, he even says, by 2010, Canada had the lowest birth rate in America as one of the lowest rates of church attendance.
Yeah.
So it's like from going from the most Catholic society in the world there in the early 1900s to, not even 100 years later, they're one of the least Catholic societies, in the Americas. And it's like, all of these liberal Catholics, these move for modernization. We want to welcome everyone into the church, make sure it's modern and open to everyone. Just our failures. It just leads to more people leaving the church.
Yeah, because what's the point?
Yeah, because then I can just join any Protestant church that does the exact same thing.
Yes,
if we're making it the same as everything else.
Well, it's like joining any club.
Yeah.
If I'm going to join, let's say like a club that is a big fan of it used to be the St. Louis Rams. So I want to have a club to root for the St. Louis Rams, and they say, well, we don't want to exclude anybody, so we're gonna root for football, and wait, well, let's just root for sport. Does anybody going to join that club? No, nobody's going to join the club because what are you going to do with your Rams shirts? Now it just says sport.
Yes.
And that's really what they're doing when they're trying to say, well, we have to include everybody.
Now it's just Christian. The more we move away from the traditions of the Catholic Church, it's just, okay, now we're just a Christian church.
Well, they're not even Christian. When they come down to it, it's like, there are standards. But anyway, so I said I wasn't going to go on these rants, so I'll stop. So we talked about religious decline. So in the educational system in Canada, the Catholics had entered into a distinctive arrangement with state-sponsored university system, which really created the leading Thomistic philosophy programs in the world. But they were successful in getting state support for the schools, but they ended up mandating curricular changes that went against Catholic teaching, because especially with regard to sexual morality, which is always what happens. That's the danger of having any sort of state funding is that's how they get their hands on you, and that's why a lot of religious leaders were opposed to like even school choice programs where the funding is going to come in there, because they're fearful that there's always going to be strings attached. So we do talk about the United States in this first chapter.
I like how he splits this up, because he says, there's really three distinct culture zones, really ethnic zones: the Spanish Southwest, the Protestant, English East Coast, and the French Mississippi Valley. And I've never really seen it separated out like that, talking about, American history, in just the terms of the cultures there.
Well, if you look at the history of Missouri, especially south of Missouri or southern Missouri, you'll have land records that go back to the competing land grants of Spain, and then France, and then the United States.
Interesting.
So, like, St. Genevieve was the, and there's no mention of St. Genevieve in here, which I thought was interesting, because it was the first Catholic church west of the Mississippi, and it was really the cathedral for this area. The Catholic outpost was in New Orleans, but then St. Genevieve was the north outpost, more prominent than St. Louis early on. But before, so that they had competing land records for who owned what, because the Spanish had it, and then they turned it over to the French, or actually the French conquered Spain and took their land holdings, I guess, and then that was sold to the United States. So you had a little bit of a mess there for a while, because they had these big land holdings and you had to decide, okay, who owns what. Anyway, so we'll start with the Spanish. So Francisco Coronado, he died in 1554, led an expedition which included a priest through the Southwest shortly after the Spanish had claimed Florida. So that the Spanish and the conquistadors came up from the south as well. into the Texas, I guess, New Mexico, Arizona, California area.
More so sticking, I think, for the most part, in California right now.
True.
That would have been the most accessible and most, naturally abundant place
right.
out of any of those mostly, desert states down there.
Yeah. I mean, they went through, but they were searching for the city of gold and all this and that, and ended up having a really miserable experience all around. Mm-hmm. But the Catholic missionaries, especially the ones that you could access from the coast, mm-hmm. Up and dotting the coastline, like the Santa Fe and all that, they were able to have these outposts and these Jesuits would come up.
Santa Fe was in New Mexico, so that's not even a coastal one. So
that is true. Yeah. What am I thinking of?
Los Angeles, San Francisco, any of those.
Santa Clara? No, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Santa Monica?
Could be.
Santas.
Lots of Santas. Yeah. Santa Claus. So the California missions, mm-hmm. Italian Jesuit Eusebio Kino. He died in
Eusebio
Kino. There you go. Died in 1711, so that gives you the time period. Came to the Southwest shortly after the 1680. There was a major Indian rebellion and killed 21 Franciscans and many others, temporarily wiping out the Spanish settlements. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so after that, this guy came up there and what was complicating things was they had these Jesuit missionaries, but they were being suppressed in Spain mm-hmm. because of the politics we talked about before, and that affected them. And so the Franciscans from Mexico were sent to California to continue the missions that the Jesuits had set up. And they eventually had a chain of 21 stretching from San Diego to San Francisco. That's what I was looking for. Mm-hmm. Including at their peak, perhaps 20,000 Indians. Yeah. That's a lot of Indians.
It is.
A lot of natives. Junipero Serra, mm-hmm. I think he was a very prominent person. I think he is... isn't there a big statue of him that was in Stanford?
Oh, maybe.
And I thought they were like protesting him or something. But he was.
Well, I know there's a statue from California of one of these guys in the U.S. Capitol. I think I pointed it out in the Capitol tour because I was in D.C. this summer. And I was surprised to see that California still has, a Catholic missionary as one of their two statues that they get to put in the U.S. Capitol building.
Yeah. It might have been him.
It could have been, yeah.
Maybe that's what I was thinking.
Possibly.
Seemed like a very devout person. Mm-hmm. He was regarded as a saint in his lifetime, and he practiced penances that may have contributed to his death. Yeah, well. For instance, when preaching, he expressed repentance for his own sins by repeatedly striking himself hard in the chest with a stone.
That'll do it.
I don't like the theatrical stuff.
Yeah.
There's really no reason for this.
I guess that's true.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, look at me. I'm hitting myself with a stone. I don't think Jesus would have advocated for you having to beat yourself up with a stone.
Probably not.
But I'm really a sinner. Well, why don't you let somebody else beat you with a stone? What are you doing it for? Really.
Yeah, I can see that.
And why does anybody know?
Yeah.
If you're trying, I'm showing my holiness or something. Anyway, I have a big problem with really theatrical religious people.
I agree.
And I probably need to get over some of that because, some of it is impressive and good. But, like our Baptist neighbors and other kind of non-denominational preacher types really get going. Like when they say the prayer at Rotary, it's like, okay. Settle down, Tiger.
Especially the Pentecostals.
This is not a revival. We want the prayer. We do the pledge, the prayer, and then we want to eat. Anyway, get on with the meeting. I'm just joking, of course.
Yes.
Did you notice that there were their missionary work was complicated because there were over 50 Indian dialects in California alone?
Yeah.
50. Mm-hmm. How do they even... How does that even... I mean, California's a big state.
Yeah.
But that is almost unbelievable to me.
Yeah, it's wild.
And they couldn't understand each other. Mm-hmm. How can 50 different communities live in the state of California and not have developed a common way of communication?
Yeah, I don't know.
You know why?
Why?
They're a bunch of illiterate nomads. Well, none of them had written language.
Yeah,
what are you doing?
True. That's true.
Write it down. How did that they didn't even think as a society, hey, we got to write this stuff down so that our kids and grandkids know this stuff. Mm-hmm. No, we have a spoken word tradition. That's stupid.
Well, it's kind of unusual, like, to have developed writing, right? Because we think, like, written language developed in maybe, like, 3 different distinct places, like, in the history of the world, and then from there it spread, elsewhere. And so it's because writing...
Where are the 3 places? China?
Like China, most likely.
India?
Probably India, and then Mediterranean.
Okay.
It's like with the Phoenician language and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so from there it spreads, but it's something that has to be taught. Because we all innately learn how to speak just by hearing and receiving language when we're young, but we don't inherently learn how to write and how to read. And that's something you have to specifically teach children and stuff like that. So it's, I think at some point in time, most places do develop written language. I mean, the Indians in Central America and South America,
Aztecs and Incas,
they had written language.
That's true.
But it's it's something that has to be taught and has to be spread.
So they had it in that continent.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just, I don't know. I don't know how you can, whatever. It just seems, I think that's a major reason why they did not develop.
Yeah. No, I agree. I know it's one of the best tools you can have as like an early civilization. You can write stuff down.
Right.
Yeah.
How else, just having directions on how to build things, because what happens if you're in a village and you're the 4 guys who knows how to build this stuff get wiped out when you're on a trip, then you've just lost it.
Yeah.
And you'd think that once that happened once, you'd be like, okay, we got to write stuff down. We got to put it somewhere so that if I die, you can find it, but
yeah,
I don't know. I don't understand. Okay. So the liturgy in this area, in this time, and the books that mentions that Indians were found to love music and imagery, so that was included in the liturgy, and so the missionaries often preached about the terrors of hell that awaited the unrepentant, because they seemed to really, be drawn to that type of imagery. But of course, there were pagan traditions that the missionaries tried to include as much as they could, as long as it was consistent, into the liturgy, and they tried to Christianize the Indians' calendar, which I think is a common thing to do. But the Indians, the natives, retained many of their old customs and beliefs, and it was very, very difficult for them to make inroads into this society.
Because so many of them would just be like dually religious. They'd
Correct.
still keep the pagan stuff, but also still, profess some sort of Christianity that combined with it.
Which, of course, is really a failure if you're a Christian, because it's monotheistic. It's like, well, you can't do this and that, because this is not compatible with that. Oh, but I'm going to do both. No. Then you're not doing the Christianity at all.
Yes.
And then the end of the missions is discussed next, and a lot of that had to do with the decline in the Indian population in around 1800 because of disease. And then Mexico won its independence from Spain, and California passed to Mexican rule. And so that, of course, undercut that type of missionary
because the Mexican government decreed that they were completely secular. They were going to be a secular nation. We're not going to support missions anymore. And he also mentions, the Enlightenment influences is what caused the Jesuits to be suppressed in Spain. And then when those same Enlightenment principles came over to the Americas, that same attitude came about. And then we get the secularization of Mexico and everything like that.
Yeah. And it makes sense to me that the Mexican government would say, we're not going, the Catholic Church is not going to be part of our government, because it was so intertwined with the Spanish government. I mean, it's really like an arm of the government. So what else do we want to talk about? Let's talk about the English is the next section. So that's primarily, there's a big discussion of the Catholics in Maryland. In 1634, Charles I of England appointed a Catholic convert, Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore, who died in 1675, to be proprietor of the new territory of Maryland. Mm-hmm. So basically the governor and the person in charge of all of Maryland.
Yeah. And he says, this is an interesting point, he says it was officially named for Queen Henrietta Maria, but Calvert probably intended to honor the Virgin Mary, and the first settlement was called St. Mary's, because I hear everybody say, oh, well, it's not named after Virgin Mary, it's named after this queen. Yeah. But, probably was trying to include the Virgin Mary in there.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. So it was not officially a Catholic colony. It was merely a place where Catholics could worship freely as opposed to other places. Mm-hmm. But there was, the author mentions, soon an attack by Protestant Virginians burned St. Mary's and forced the governor and the 2 Jesuits to flee briefly. Catholic estates were plundered and 4 Catholics were hanged. So there was some Catholic, but I guess it wasn't official government policy. There's more rioters or unlawful acts, I guess you'd say. So they passed after that the Maryland Toleration Act, which forbade harassment or persecution anyone who believed in Jesus Christ, making Maryland the only colony other than predominantly Baptist Rhode Island to allow this freedom. Mm-hmm. But you better believe in Jesus Christ or else you're in trouble. Yeah. So there's a minimum, like a minimum cover charge. Got to be at least Christian, otherwise you're on your own.
Yeah. But the act was repealed when Protestants seized the government, but then was reenacted at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, interestingly.
Yeah. So the English penal laws against Catholics were declared to be enforced and then undone. Forth, So there was some official anti-Catholicism for a period of time, at least in Maryland. So the Jesuits worked in that area as well. I mean, they were everywhere, weren't they?
Yeah, they really were.
And they supported themselves by farms of their own, which often were worked by slaves. So that's unfortunate for the Jesuits. More unfortunate for the slaves. But it really was universal. Yeah. I'm not trying to excuse it, because you think that the clergy would not have slaves, for crying out loud.
But evidently not.
How cheap are you? Pay the guy. Why does he have to do this for you? But I guess I could kind of go to the first bishop, which was John Carroll, isn't that right? And he proclaimed Catholic support for the revolution and the new government. There were then about 25,000 Catholics in the 13 new states, or about 1% of the population. So it's not a huge population. And in 1808, dioceses were established in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Bardstown in Kentucky, what became Kentucky, I believe. And Baltimore became an archdiocese.
There you go.
There's so few Catholics as a percentage of the population, which I forget, because now it's like, isn't it the single biggest denomination still in the United States?
I think it is.
Because all those Irish coming
the Italians.
Over. That's true. And Germans.
German Catholics. Some Germans, yeah.
No, the good ones. So religious liberty, there's a discussion of that as well around this time. This is where before appointing Carroll as the bishop, the Holy See, I'm just going to read this from the book, queried the fledgling American government as to whether the appointment was acceptable, and received a surprising answer that was of no concern to the government. At that time, and for a long time afterward, the United States was the only country in the world where it was possible for the church to erect dioceses and parishes, et cetera, without any sort of governmental approval or involvement. And I just didn't appreciate that. How revolutionary, truly revolutionary, the American country, the United States was.
Very true.
With regard to religious freedom. I mean, I knew, it was the first country to have it, like we have it in our Constitution, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and all that stuff. And I don't take that for granted, but those kind of ministerial or administrative aspects of it, I didn't even really think about, this really makes a big difference in how the church is run even.
Yeah. Especially even like the establishment of schools. It's like that's so much of what like the government likes to have control over is what the population is being taught.
Right.
But, the American government was like, well, if you want to teach them this, you can teach them this. And that's it's fine with us. I don't think we can say the same thing anymore now at this point in American history. But, very early on, it was the idea of, yeah, sure, you have that right to teach these kids what you want to teach them. It's no business of mine how you're educating them.
Yeah. It's really tremendous.
Yeah.
Really neat. So let's see. I don't know if I want to go into all these details, but about this guy Carroll, but he opposed bringing foreign priests into America, which I thought was kind of interesting. He wanted his own priests here that knew the local vernacular, but. In order to train clergy for the new country that had been spawned by a revolution, he found it necessary to welcome French priests. He calls them Sulpicians. I don't know what that is. What is that?
I don't know.
Should have looked it up. Fleeing the revolution in their own country. So the French, because the French Revolution happened, shortly after the United States Revolution. And so they had to welcome in these guys for a while. They started St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, which this Carroll bishop hoped there would be the seedbed of native vocations. Although for a long time most students were foreign. Anyway, so there's also discussion of religious women, nuns and convents and that sort of thing. And then any mention of American history has to mention Alexis de Tocqueville, which is with his work, which I've never read, Democracy in America, but I've heard so much about how important it was to understanding America at the time. It's another book I'm threatening to read, but never have. I've had an occasion to start it and never got through it. I don't know why. But he pointed out that even though there was no official church in the United States, it did not indicate irreligion, but quite the opposite. There's just churches everywhere. It's still churches everywhere. I joke about how you can't throw a rock in our town without hitting some sort of church. There's 2 Catholic churches in this immediate area. Used to be another one in Herculaneum, but the lead company had to buy that out.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
There's was it Assumption? I'm trying to remember, but that was years ago. They used to have a Catholic church there, and of course it was in the old part of town, which after the lead plant shut down, kind of got depopulated, and they had to buy it out because they were poisoning everybody.
That's unfortunate.
But anyway, so they got those 2. You got Baptist churches everywhere. They got non-denominational churches, and then other kind of...
We have Lutherans. We have, I think, Presbyterians as well.
Correct. Right on
Is there
Main
a
Street.
Methodist church?
I believe so. Isn't that the one that's right next to where Books Galore used to be? What is that?
That's Presbyterian, I think.
Really?
I think so.
I don't know. What's the difference between
Maybe it is
Presbyterian and Methodist?
I think it is Methodist.
What's the difference between them?
I don't know.
Is Presbyterians basically like Anglicans? I don't know what these people are.
The Presbyterians were, I think, a Scottish branch of Anglicanism.
There you go. See, I was close, wasn't I?
I think so. Or maybe the Presbyterians predate Anglicanism. I don't know. I think we read about this in a different chapter.
We're professing our ignorance.
Yes, that's true.
But the point is...
They're all wrong.
Even though... that's not the point I was going to say. Even though there's no official religion, it doesn't mean that we're not a religious country. Yeah. And even though, I know church attendance is down, it has been declining, there's still a lot of people going to church.
That's true.
Just a lot of different churches. And have common themes. I'm trying to be optimistic about that. And I think people are going to church just not as often, too, which I think contributes to the lack of religious attendance. Anyway, so there's the discussion of the Second Great Awakening. And, of course, all the founding fathers were influenced by the British Enlightenment. A lot of them were just deists. They weren't really religious people. They were Freemasons for the most part.
Especially Thomas Jefferson. He was a huge deist.
Yes.
My least favorite founding father. Everybody loves Thomas Jefferson. I did not like Thomas Jefferson. He was crazy.
What do you mean he's crazy?
He was the most, liberal, least conservative, most, because he believed, every, 30 years there should be a new revolution. He did not believe in a stable government. He thinks that the people should always rise up and overthrow who's above them. just as a matter of a period of time. He didn't believe in really.
I think you might be overstating that, but he was an early supporter of the French Revolution.
Yes,
he was like the last of the founding fathers or the leaders at the time to really come to the obvious conclusion: this is just mass murder.
Yeah,
with a different motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right about that, because he was rightfully criticized for justifying the French Revolution, when it should have been apparent to everybody, including him, that it was just a terrible development. But yeah, I'm not arguing about that. He was very articulate with regard to the intellectual basis for individual rights. I think he was very articulate in that, and he had an important counterbalance to the founding fathers who were too enamored with quasi. What do I want to say? I just completely lost the word. Monarchical basis of power, because John Adams was almost a monarchist, and there was. It would have been pretty easy for Washington to declare himself king, or to be able to accept a position that would be very royal-like or king-like at the time.
That's true.
And it was only because, and for him to step down after 2 terms was unheard of. Mm-hmm. And just go back to his farm. So anyway, there was a second great awakening they talked about, which his author describes, stamped on the country a deeply Christian character that survives into the 21st century to a certain degree. The hippies are trying to kill it.
Yeah, I think this book was written about 10 years ago. So I think a lot has changed in the past decade.
Yeah, it really has. And it is kind of striking with a lot of those things. So
I'm speaking, I was 10 years old, or 9 years old 10 years old a decade ago. So yes. I'm not really sure what it was like a decade ago.
I do.
Yes.
And you were right.
That is true.
Yes. So the religious rights were a lot of times were protected by the Supreme Court, by recognizing Catholic marriages and independence of private religious colleges, the rights of churches to import foreign clergy.
And the reason was because he quotes, I'm assuming, a Supreme Court ruling, quote, "We are a Christian nation." That was the reasoning for allowing the Catholic Church to import, foreign priests.
Yes. Well, that's true too. And one of the important things which people don't really appreciate is that disputes with regard to internal church matters under United States law are to be decided according to the church's own laws, which for the Catholic Church is huge because it has an established canon law. But you'll see these fights break out about the management of the finances mainly, but also the administration of different churches. And that's what saves the Catholic Church in a lot of respects from people that are trying to assert local control over even doctrine, or who the priest is going to be, or what the priest can do or can't do. And all those kind of disputes is established law and all across the United States that is none of the court's business, other than if the law has to be involved, it's going to enforce the church's law and the church's rules in the dispute. So it becomes like a contract dispute. And the contract is written by the religious structure itself. And so it's not what the Missouri law would say about this dispute. It's going to be what the church's law does.
Interesting.
And people don't appreciate that. That's a big deal. In fact, we had I won't talk about it too much, but there was a local dispute with regard to a Eastern Orthodox parish locally. And so that those issues came up as far as management and organization of the church, which is different because they're more congregational than the formal structure that the Catholic Church has. So but the courts staying out of that business has been very important. And there was a lot of litigation locally about St. Stanislaus, which you're too young to even know about. But that was, I think I mentioned in a previous podcast. It ended up ending badly almost for everybody involved, but and the Catholic Church kind of lost some of that argument over the finances, and they just kind of wrote it off, and It's unfortunate for everybody.
I do like the point he makes about education. He says the environment was so favorable to religious education that in 1844, the Supreme Court seriously considered the claim that prohibiting the teaching of religion in a privately endowed school constituted blasphemy.
Yeah.
If you forbid teaching religion, you're a blasphemer, essentially, and that'd be punishable by law. He says Catholics took full advantage of this good environment, establishing almost 300 institutions of higher learning, not including seminaries.
Yeah.
Such as colleges that were founded by the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, they're everywhere. Mm-hmm. Now, almost none of the Catholic universities or colleges are Catholic anymore. Yeah, they're in name only. They may have some sort of left-wing rainbow flag-waving priest involved, but not much else.
Yeah,
like Notre Dame has so much of it is in favor of abortion. It's just crazy.
Yeah, that is true.
And if it's a Catholic university, they ought to kick those people out. Fire them.
Yeah.
Fire them all.
Absolutely.
But what does Catholicism has to do with physics? Well, yeah, exactly. Shut up. Teach physics, or you're fired. Go out there and start talking about how everybody should be aborting their children. You're fired. Yeah. I don't know what's so complicated about that. That's not Catholic.
I agree.
But I'm a physics teacher. Actually, the physics is probably the least likely to do that.
That's true.
But I'm using that as an obvious example.
Yes.
Anyway, that was another rant. So, what else do we want to talk about?
We'll probably move on to the French.
Okay. De Soto.
Yes.
There's a town south of here called De Soto.
That is true.
Named after the Spanish explorer, Hernando de Soto. That's an old town, by the way. Mm-hmm. That is almost as old, maybe older than Herculaneum.
Really?
Yeah, as an outpost. Old towns here in our part of Missouri, older than St. Louis. People don't realize that. Like Potosi was super old too because they had the mines down there. Anyway, because we talked about that in a previous episode. So it was let's see, what were we going to talk about there?
A Franciscan member of De Soto's party stayed in the United States, or what became the United States.
Yes.
And he remained to convert the Indians in northeast Kansas, becoming the first North American martyr in 1542. I didn't know that about him.
Kansans.
Kansas sucks.
Well, they weren't really Kansas then. It was just
true.
Indian, but yeah, he was. I did not know the first North American martyr was this guy from De Soto's party
Juan de Padilla.
that was killed in Kansas in 1542. Yeah. So what about Marquette and Joliet? Very prominent names in the Chicago region.
That's true.
Because these were missionaries and explorers, Jesuits, Jacques Marquette and layman Louis Joliet, who died in 1700. They rediscovered the Mississippi and traveled much of its length and originally named it what?
The Immaculate Conception.
There it is, yeah. We just saw a statute. Didn't we just see a statute for talking about Marquette?
Yeah.
Up in Chicago?
We were up in Chicago. It's on a bridge that crosses the Chicago River.
Yep. But the name did not stick to the Mississippi. It should have.
It should have.
I think we need to start a movement to rename the Mississippi the Immaculate Conception.
At least in Missouri, we could start small. Wherever the Mississippi River touches Missouri, that is now the Immaculate Conception.
Kind of like how they have those. You name a highway.
Yeah.
Like Highway 55 is the such and such, like the Reagan Memorial Highway from this mile marker to that mile marker. The Mississippi should be the Immaculate Conception from. Through the borders or along the borders of Missouri. I agree. I'm going to start that tomorrow.
Good.
So, of course, there were Indian missions into this area. The Jesuits penetrated south from the Great Lakes. Sounds like an invasion. I guess it kind of was. And the parish of Cahokia, Illinois, which is not far from here, opposite of St. Louis, claims to be the oldest continuous parish in the United States, having been founded as an Indian mission in 1699.
Yeah.
And it just mentions in passing, there were some missionary martyrs. But the Plains Indians were what? Nomadic illiterates. There you go. Hunters, which hampered the missionary efforts. What else hampered them? Polygamy. Yeah, of course. So of course they had struggles which are similar to the other areas, and then lead and other minerals was discovered on the west side of the Mississippi, bringing an influx of settlers who would later become Missouri, which is Herculaneum, Potosi, et cetera, et cetera.
St. Genevieve.
St. Genevieve was founded before that, coming up the Mississippi. But the lead belt, which Leadington is one of them. What's the other lead? There's Leadington. There's lead. There's a couple towns named after lead.
Well, don't we have a Steelville nearby?
There's a Steelville down in that's a little bit west.
Yeah.
It's better to be in a town called Steelville than Leadington because lead that's a poison.
That is true.
It retards intellectual. What are you giggling for?
I thought
that's
you were just
a real world.
That, yes.
No, that's it retards intellectual development in children. And it's a tremendous tragedy. Because it's not anyway. I don't want to go there. All right, so Upper Mississippi, following the 7 Years' War, which was 1756 through 1763, France had to cede the Illinois country to England. So they had a war with England
and transferred the west side of the Mississippi to Spain. So they kind of just lost all of their territory. Although he says the majority of the white inhabitants were still French in origin. So they were still sort of culturally French and probably still spoke the French language, although technically they now existed under the English or the Spanish government, depending on which side of the Mississippi they were on. Yep.
And if they were Jesuits on the Spanish side, they got expelled. Let's see. So then the Americans is the next section. It mentions the Louisiana Territory being sold to the United States, which is a huge deal in the history of the world, actually, I think. But there's also a mention of Louisiana, which is the Creole clergy and the Gallican type of society. And there was the first bishop was de Burgh, who was a native of Santo Domingo, and was essentially driven out of New Orleans by the clergy and moved his seat to St. Louis.
There you go.
Which is Bishop de Burgh High School is named after him, I believe.
Became a diocese in 1826. Yeah. And St. Louis Diocese was founded.
So there's a mention of the Upper Mississippi, and there's the French Catholics going up to the Upper Mississippi. And there was, around 1820, an influx of missionaries began a revival. Flemish Jesuits, French Sacred Heart Sisters, and multinational group of Vincentians arrived in Missouri almost simultaneously. Let's all meet there.
Yeah, because they really wanted to initially mission to the Indian people, but they found like all of the the French people who were living there, they'd just been essentially completely abandoned by the Catholic Church because all the Jesuits were kicked out, and so then they just needed to really establish churches and bring the church back to what these people had originally about 50 years beforehand.
Right. Interesting. So there's a mention of Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne, who, when I went to Duchesne High School, was just Blessed Philippine Duchesne. She was canonized during my lifetime. And so that's always weird to see Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne. But she was superior of the Sacred Heart Sisters, and there's a Sacred Heart School that is on that spot in St. Charles.
Interesting.
St. Charles, Missouri. So the Jesuits took charge of a school that became St. Louis University.
The first university west of the Mississippi. That's what he says.
Is that right?
That's what he says.
I guess that is right.
Yeah.
So there's missionaries and Catholic. Let's see. Oh yeah, there was a guy here. I thought this was funny. Founder of the State University of Michigan's first congressman. Ironically, he was in jail for debt when he was elected. I don't know why they mentioned that, but I thought that was funny.
That is funny.
So the eclipse of the French. That means the Irish are coming. All the Irish priests eclipsed all the French, don't you think?
Yes.
And there was
beginning in 1841. Is the first really Irish bishop, Peter Richard Kenrick of St. Louis, who discouraged French priests from serving in the see in 1841.
So the Kenrick Seminary is named after him.
I would imagine.
Yes. Whereupon all the French priests departed.
There you go.
Goodbye. What's the French word for goodbye?
Adieu, I guess you can say.
Adieu? Yeah, I guess that's right. So what else do we want to say about any of this stuff? There were mission rivalries. They were in competition with some Protestants, which Protestants weren't at the time as devoted to missionary work.
But he says, as the Indians came under the authority of the federal government, the various tribes were assigned to different churches, and they usually favored Protestants. And that's where he says is one of the few times, he says the only instance in American history where the church's pastoral activity was restricted by law.
Yeah.
Because they'd place the Indians usually under Protestants rather than Catholics.
Right.
Which is interesting. I didn't even know that they placed them under a church necessarily.
Yeah, I didn't either.
It's fascinating.
Reading this.
Yes.
So the eclipse of the Spanish, the westward movement, of course, everybody moving out west, and the gold rush and all the settlers and the Anglos and all that kind of stuff. St. Louis becoming an archdiocese happens, and then the Spanish, as it had done, I'm going to quote from this, as it had done in the Mississippi Valley, the westward movement diluted the old ethnic character of California Catholicism, California Catholicism, so that in time the Hispanics found themselves outnumbered by the Irish and under the authority of mainly Irish bishops, which I thought was really wild.
Yeah.
And they were building cathedrals which were in the Romanesque style as opposed to the local architectural style or the Spanish architectural style at the time. And so you have an immigrant church with all these Irish coming up after the potato famine. And of course, we talked before about how they had such devout Catholics in Ireland. Mm-hmm. They had an excess, a surplus of priests, so they would go to other areas. Mm-hmm. There's a mention of the Germans coming over in that same period of time. The German Catholics. They talked about over 4 million Irish Catholics coming over between 1820 and 1920. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of people because they were just starving to death and the British weren't feeding them. So they had to come over here. It was that or die. Yeah. I mean, literally starving to death. Yeah. It was crazy. So there was some dissatisfaction with the French clergy, especially the bishops who were considered autocratic. Mm-hmm. And so the Irish really were really taking over the administration of the church, I think, during this period of time. And most of the bishops were Irish. So if you look at the ethnicity of them, they really were very effective at administering the Catholic Church at the time. He
says a lot of the reason for that was just because they spoke English.
Yeah,
so all these French, people would have spoken French, of course, and so they wouldn't become bishops because they couldn't speak to the dominant language of their territories.
Right. And I think they didn't really care for the Irish Catholics.
That's
thought
true.
They were less than human and dirty people. And there was a huge amount of bigotry against the Irish. The British, there were legitimate theories that the Irish weren't quite human.
Yeah, no,
they were like ape-like creatures. Anyway, so there is a talk about architecture. I don't know if we really want to talk about that. The Greek revival style or federal style of buildings, which I think is interesting, but I don't think we need to go through too much of that. But the growth of the church is really fascinating. By 1870, the number of Catholics had increased to 4.5 million, or 12% of the total population. I mean, that's a huge difference from 1% to 12% in a relatively short period of time.
Like 100 years.
Yeah,
a little less.
And I know the country's growing, but to have that percentage to shoot up that much is a huge
11%. That's wild.
Huge change. And of course there was a certain amount of anti-Catholicism. And I think it was more ethnic hatred maybe in the United States, which is this the Know Nothing Party. That was formed prior to the Civil War, because there's this massive immigration, and so you had the people that were here, they were Protestants. They were like, oh my gosh, all these Catholics are coming in here, all these dirty Irish and Italians and all this other stuff, and they're diluting our power and our authority and all that, which you see in any wave of immigration.
He does mention before the Know Nothings there, which I thought was an interesting point, with the Protestants during the Mexican War of the 1840s, American troops would sometimes desecrate Catholic churches, which provoked some of the Irish to desert to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans named them the San Patricio Brigade after St. Patrick. Because all these Irish, like, oh, you're destroying Catholic churches. I'm not going to fight for you. I'm going to fight for these Catholics instead.
Right. Well, yeah, because there's the Catholic Spanish churches. Yeah, I never knew that. I never read anything about any of that. And I've read some about that fight and that war, and I never noticed that before I read about that. That was weird. And I guess it would be It would be tough. It would, it'd be like, I mean, you can think of modern examples of, trying to go over to some other country and desecrate all their religious, but you got people in your own army. They're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
So it's my religion, knuckleheads. But then for them to go on and fight for the other side.
Interesting.
Of course, they were probably immigrants and not
too closely aligned with, the American people anyway.
Right. Interesting. All right. So the elite prejudice. And there's a mention in the book that elite opinion deplored the syllabus of errors, which I thought was kind of wild. Of course, they didn't like the papal infallibility issue. And I don't know what else we want to talk about that. Oh, yeah, the Harvard Law School would not admit graduates of Jesuit colleges on the grounds that their education did not qualify them.
Yeah. That's pretty wild.
Harvard sucked for like forever, hasn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
They were anti-Jewish. They're now anti-Asian. When have they ever been good? Is there examples of Harvard being like an outpost of enlightenment and just and right things in the world?
Know.
I think they've always been horrible. I mean, they're supposed to be like a great, law school and all that stuff, but they've been a hotbed of discrimination.
It's true.
Unlawful and unethical discrimination for so many years. Why does anybody even care about anybody who goes to Harvard?
He does mention now the Germans. The German Triangle is what he calls it.
Yeah.
That stretched from Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee when you had, the predominant, population became German immigrants, in sort of that upper Midwest area there. And so that's really essentially, now we have both Irish and Germans as the most prominent sort of leadership of the Catholic Church in this portion of America.
Yep. And you have the traditional, in this area, traditional Irish parishes, traditional German parishes, and also the older traditional French parishes, like St. Genevieve. And sometimes, and I'm trying to remember, in St. Charles, there were two parishes really close to each other, founded around the same time. St. Charles Borromeo, which would have French, right? And then St. Peter's, which I think was a German parish. So I think they were very close to each other. And I believe that one was specifically a French development. The other one was a German church.
Huh. Yeah. Fascinating.
So I think there's a lot of that stuff. What else do we want to say? I think I'm kind of think we're, there's a discussion again about parochial schools and that kind of development. But I think it's really just more of the same that, I did want to mention, like with the parochial schools, the Catholic Church was really emphatic at the time. So like, there was a Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, 1884, that mandated all their parishes sponsor a parish school. And I think they need to get back to that. Yeah. Because without the parish schools, you're seeing the rate of church attendance and sacraments, everything declining terribly. And I don't think the church can survive without having church-sponsored Catholic schools that are either free or close to being free for the parents. Well,
I think it's also important to note that the reason they had this council is because the common schools, which he says began to spread after 1850, were essentially Protestant, which would require prayers and readings from the Protestant Bible.
Right.
And so now we're at a point in time when there's just no Christianity in schools, and you really don't see any movement to be like, hey, we need to get our schools back and operational, and things are much worse for Catholics rather than just reading from, the Protestant Bible. So there's just no religious teaching at all. And if you want to keep, a population, religious and especially Catholic, you need to have some sort of really devout, really well-sponsored Catholic education, or it's just going to keep declining.
Yes. So what else do we want to talk about? Talk about the political fights with between Catholics and all that. The labor unions were very much composed of Catholics in their ranks. And there was a ban, like the Vatican did not like the unions at first, and there was a Cardinal James Given of Baltimore persuaded the Vatican to lift the ban on these Catholic
Knights
groups.
of Labor is what they called it. It was just an early union. They called it a secret society akin to the Masons. And it's like, well, we don't want to associate anything with the Masons.
Right, yeah. And so they had a fear of it, but anyway. So and then of course the Catholics. Irish Catholics especially were very good at the local governmental level and the patronage system at the time. in Boston and Chicago. I don't know if that's even in the book, but I'm just talking about that stuff. So what else do we want to talk about?
The last big topic is slavery before we wrap up our part one here, which is interesting in how Catholics played into that here.
Well, officially, since the 15th century, the popes have condemned slavery. Mm-hmm. So officially, they were very, very good at it. I mean, as far as the Catholic teaching early on. But few Catholics in America were involved in the anti-slavery movement. Mm-hmm. And the Irish Catholic immigrants, the only people I think they were above in society were the blacks, and the slaves. And so there were not a whole lot of Catholic rank and file support for the anti-slavery movement. Mm-hmm. I just don't think there was.
It's unfortunate.
Yes. I mean, but yeah. So anyway, then there was pro-slavery Catholics. There were several Maryland Catholics who were implicated in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Although it was unclear how extensive that was, but
he does also mention the Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, which held that slaves had no rights, was a Catholic, and he was the first Catholic he held the highest position of any American Catholic prior to 1961, of course, with JFK. Yes. So he was the Chief Justice, and he was the one writing that really horrible decision about Dred Scott.
Truth. There's a mention of Bishop Carroll. Owned slaves.
Yeah.
With a little apparent crisis of conscience. Some religious communities owned slaves, mm-hmm. and one Maryland superior was removed by the Jesuit general for having allowed slave families to be broken up through sales.
Yeah.
Man, that's pretty deep into it. Mm-hmm. And during the Civil War, there were Catholics that were fighting on both sides of the Civil War. I already mentioned the draft riots, which I think was like a Catholic group fighting. Of course, it was a slaughterhouse, mm-hmm. so it was pretty complicated. But and then in the Reconstruction, there was the Supreme Court overturned a conviction of a Missouri priest who refused to take the oath of loyalty to the Union, mm-hmm. Saying it was against his religious beliefs, and so you even have those kind of issues afterwards. Mm-hmm. Let's see, and then there was I did want to mention after this, even though there was a whole bunch of racial prejudice, there was a priest, African American black priest. Father Tolton. Mm-hmm. And you may recognize that because he's from Missouri, and there's a Father Tolton High School.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In Columbia, Missouri.
Oh, interesting.
Who every once in a while they played, I think, against Pius at some point.
Interesting.
Either made the trip down here or we made the trip up there. Huh. But that high school was only formed in 2010.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But they named it after him. He was from that area, and he was a former slave. He was born a slave in Missouri. But he was the first black priest in the United States. And I don't think he was in Missouri when he was a priest, mm-hmm. but he was from Missouri, which I thought was an interesting local connection.
Yeah.
And there's a number of black Catholics mm-hmm. in parishes across the United States. But I don't think it's a huge number as a percentage of the African American population, but they used to be more.
That is true.
Any other thoughts about this era, or did I go through too quickly? Or?
No, I think that's good. I think we're wrapping it up. I think the next section is very interesting when he gets into Americanism. So that's something to look forward to in the next chapter, sort of how there's a movement to modernize the Catholic Church in the same way that it happened in Canada, essentially. So really, not great stuff there, but interesting to read about. No, I really like this chapter. I like this breakdown here of really sort of the three distinct zones and how Catholicism played into those, which I thought was interesting. Again, I'd never seen it laid out in that way. Right. I think it's a good way to separate sort of the history of the United States in these three very, very different cultural zones.
Yes, all Catholic, but from different European powers, and European Catholic Church hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. True. Very true. Very true. Do you have any other final thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Season 6, Episode 19 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
There you go.